Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to contribute to today's discussions. It's a pleasure to follow on from my old friend Kim Beazley, and I know he would have loved to be here, and he's probably particularly uncomfortable with the fact that I'll be answering questions on his behalf. Some things never change. As I walked into this room, I saw many familiar faces, people that supported me during my years as Minister, and I'm pleased to see that they're still so engaged. Some, like Chris Barry, are looking younger. Some, like Mike Pazzulo, are looking older. Mick Roach is looking the same. Paul Dibbs seems to be forever. Got a good run again in Kim Beazley's presentation today. And even my young staffer, Sean Costello, who addressed the conference earlier in the day, or maybe it was the Associated Conference, on behalf of defence industry, in which he said governments need to have an 80-year vision. And when I saw his speech, I sent him a message back reminding him that the political term was 3 years. So there still seems to be a little disconnect between what industry would like and what the political realities are. I've been asked to follow on with the period of the Howard government, so I'm talking about 1996 to 2007, which includes my period as Defence Minister, which was 4 years from 2002 to 2006, but reminds me that over that period we in fact had 5 Defence Ministers, probably a bit more than's desirable in 11 years. Ian McLaughlin, John Moore, Peter Reith, myself, and then Brendan Nelson. And I'm reminded, although I didn't need it, that the Chiefs of Navy during my time were David Shackleton, Chris Ritchie and Russ Shoulders. Before that it was Rod Taylor and Donald Chalmers. So Kim Beazley talked a lot about the strategic guidance and the basis, the reasons for which the government of the day, through its white papers, determined that guidance. During my time, we didn't write another white paper, and this was actually despite some within defence that argued that we should do so. But I guess if you have a section in defence whose job it is to write white papers, they like to be tasked to write white papers. But I was of the view that that white papers are not something that you do often. In fact, you only do it, you could legitimately do it with a change of government, but otherwise you only do it if you believe that the strategic guidance under which you've been operating is out of date. I was operating under a white paper that was put down in the year 2000, and so we'd had a few years after we got into government to think about what we were wanting to say, and we completed that white paper process, which we took very, very seriously, with long and complex periods of public consultation and the like. And I found that in looking at that white paper, although we faced a range of new challenges, some of which have been mentioned, the issues of terrorism, the regional stabilisation challenges and the like. In fact, the guidance within the paper and WMD, the guidance had foreshadowed that risk and therefore had incorporated the need to be ready to meet that challenge if it in fact was presented. And one of the things that I found interesting about Kim Beazley's presentation today was that although his guidance, his white papers, were heavily premised on the concept of defence of Australia and self-reliance, and he reminded us that in fact, in part, that went back to political attitudes within the Labor Party following the end of the Vietnam War. He found that when the threats that he had to address, the tasks that he had to meet, were not those that were anticipated, primarily anticipated within the guidance, he nevertheless had the capability within the force to meet those challenges. But it is nevertheless interesting to see the differences in emphasis, and I'll only say it's in emphasis, but what we used to tease Kim on the principle, we described his policy as the policy of concentric circles. You have a more intense capability the closer you get to the Australian mainland, and you have these circles that move out. We tended to see the globe a little differently and suspected that the tasks that we might be engaged in could well be further afield, which in fact turned out to be the case. We believe there was, perhaps more than Kim did, a greater likelihood of being requested to be part of expeditionary forces, and maybe on our side of politics we were more inclined to be ready to join those expeditionary requirements. But as he said in his presentation today, he was nevertheless faced with the issue of the first Gulf War, and his government decided to contribute naval capabilities on Australia's behalf. And when I look at our doctrine in the 2000 white paper, I have to concede that we were given 4 different levels of potential threat stroke task, and I think the expeditionary potential was still listed as number 4. But the point that I'm really wanting to make is that he found that although things didn't work out exactly as he anticipated, that he found there was sufficient flexibility in Australia's naval capabilities to meet the unexpected as well as the expected. And although we had put the likelihood of involvement in operations against terrorists and to constrain weapons of mass destruction at the like as a lower likelihood, we nevertheless found that we had the capability within Australia's Navy to meet all of those contingencies. And I guess that's one of the principal lessons that came from my experience. And when we talk about capability requirements, where Australia is never going to have a large navy, we are more likely than not to face a whole range of different contingencies, and we need to build as much flexibility as possible into our force structure, because the unexpected is just as likely to be before us as the expected. So many of Kim's decisions, and some of which he mentioned today, I inherited, which I guess is the second point that I really wanted to make, and that is that ministers change, defence chiefs change, but there is nevertheless a capability that's got to continue, notwithstanding. So I inherited a certain continuity, I guess. What I inherited was the two-ocean basing decision. I inherited the Collins-class submarines, although at that time Rankin had not been commissioned. I inherited the Adelaide class frigates. The upgrade decision I got from a colleague, but I think the decision to decommission 2 was in my time. The Anzac class frigates were in the process of being delivered. I made the decision on the air warfare destroyers and also on the new Armidale patrol boats. I remember the debate about should they be aluminium, is that a risk? And there were the 3 contenders bidding, 1 steel, 1 aluminium, and 1, I called it plastic, but a composite. And I can remember being up in Newcastle, and must have been, was it 4 Jacks? But anyway, one of those in Newcastle were wanting to demonstrate to me the quality of the composite, and they were dropping sharp spikes onto this composite material to convince me that this was the way to go with a new class of patrol boats. I must say, in passing, we never envisaged that the Armidale class would have to work as hard as they have, and I commend those who've had to serve on them in circumstances beyond that which we anticipated. The new Canberra class amphibious ships was within our white paper, but I worked on that project, and although I didn't make the ultimate choice between the French and the Spanish designs, looking at both the French ship and visiting the Spanish shipyard and talking to them about their options was an informative experience for me. A capability that I am very pleased that Australia is getting, because, with what I've just said about flexibility, I think the ships will give our Navy great capacity and great flexibility. And I, of course, had both the Canimbla and the Manura, and in my time they did a great job. I inherited from a colleague the Huon-class mine hunters. I was responsible for the purchase of a fleet oiler. In relation to the fleet arm, I inherited the Seahawks and Sea Kings, and I inherited the decision to purchase and refurbish the Sea Sprites. I'm probably one of the few people in this room that's actually flown in a refurbished Sea Sprite. The only problem was that after we'd completed the flight and my pilots returned to headquarters, a question arose about whether the aircraft was certified for the flight. But nevertheless, we got back. So I learnt a lot from that project, and I have to say that really the major challenges I had in the portfolio were challenges relating to the refurbishment of equipment, and I think it pays to be realistic up front. One of the good things about defence, but also one of the things that needs to be watched carefully, is when you say to the military, "Can this be done?" the answer is always, "Yes, sir." But sometimes it's probably not the best answer to receive, and I hope that we've learnt some lessons from that. But I have to say, in relation to the subject that's brought up so often, and that is the Collins class submarines, of where I was deeply involved in issues of refurbishment almost before they were operational. When we, and it's not in the brief that was kindly sent to me, but when we sent those boats on operational tasks, they did a superb job. And Kim would like to hear me say this, that I think that they've in many ways received a bad press. And I guess it's relevant, the future as well, that a submarine are very complex, and the challenge of building, operating and upgrading submarines is a huge and complex task, and won't come without a few tears. So with that, I wanted to talk a bit about the operations, because although we make the decisions to deploy, we have very little to do with how successful or otherwise the operations are. But my period of time as Minister, and really the whole of the Howard government, was one in which the Navy was very, very busy on so many different tasks, and did an excellent job. So I thought I'd just touch on a few, because I think it'll remind you, and a few who are visitors maybe not have heard this before, the breadth of the tasks, the operations that the Royal Australian Navy undertook during that period of the Howard government. My briefing note just separates what is called the routine tasks from the named operational tasks. But even those routine tasks were full of challenge: very difficult search and rescue operations, work on the National Surveillance Program, the hydrographic support in support of commercial shipping, the major bilateral and multilateral exercises, many challenging tasks within what is described as routine. But beyond routine, there were a whole range of very important operations that have become part of the legacy of the Royal Australian Navy, of which its service personnel should be very, very proud. The first was Operation Damask, which was the ADF's contribution to the economic and military sanctions against Iraq from 1990 to 2001, to conduct compliant boardings, to interdict illegal and smuggling trade, and they resulted in significant reductions to the extent of goods being smuggled out of Iraq, and were a credit to the Navy. The second area is one that many within the Navy probably wished they had never been asked to do, which were the Southern Ocean's fisheries patrols. Sounds pretty straightforward, but in ships that were really not built for the task, in the most inhospitable of waters, they were hugely challenging. So Operation Dirk in 1997, Operation Stanhope also in 1997, Operation T-Bone in 2001, which resulted in the successful apprehension of the South Toomey after a 2,200 nautical pursuit across the Southern Ocean, being joined later on by the Navy of South Africa. A huge achievement. Operation Gemsbok, which apprehended the Viasa 1, which I remember well, and Operation Celeste, which apprehended the Maya 5. One area I do know about is Kamilar and conservation in the southern oceans, and the operations of the Royal Australian Navy really changed the game. It was after the marauders realised that there was a force that was going to be dispatched that would chase them from one side of the ocean to the other until they were caught. Before that, they basically were free to do as they pleased. After that, the whole game changed. And that area is largely free of what I refer to as the pirates now, and it wouldn't be so without the efforts of the Royal Australian Navy. And I remember, I'm not sure which one of the operations it was, but in one instance, a boarding craft had been sent to apprehend the illegal boat and overturned, and I think 2 men of our Navy were in the water, and the second boarding boat was sent, and it overturned, so there were 4 in the water, and there was 1 helicopter on the ship, and the 1 helicopter was dispatched to rescue the 4 men and succeeded in doing so. But you don't last long in the Southern Ocean, and with the 1 ship in terrible conditions, it just illustrated to me as minister, and for some reason or other I was doing a conference in Sydney, and the Navy kindly were giving me up-to-the-minute reports of how these men were faring in the water. But it was one of those occasions as minister that you have this sudden feeling, was it the right decision to send forces into that environment? And I know that the officers and men weren't all that keen to go down there, but I do remember coming upon one of those ships in the Gulf one day, and the same men who weren't so keen to go down there were so proud when they showed me the photos of the apprehension of this ship after such a challenging mission. They were really chuffed with what they had achieved, and so they should be. Then 1997 to 2006, Operation Cranberry, Australia's fisheries patrols in Northern Australia, which were also tricky in many ways, politically tricky. And then from 97 to 98 was the assistance to Bougainville, Operation Belle Isle, together with New Zealand, assistance to the Australian-New Zealand Truce Monitoring Group in Bougainville, and then Operation Belle Isle 2, 1998 to 2001, to provide further support. That mission was successful in the end. It was a nasty environment, and the backup of the Royal Australian Navy was critically important. And we were most appreciative of them being there and providing that support. 1998, Operation Avarian Linnet, supporting the AFPs and agencies and drug enforcement operations off New South Wales. There were several operations of that type. And then we moved to the East Timor suite of operations. 1997, Operation Spitfire, following the surge of violence in East Timor after the referendum on independence, followed by Operation Warden and Operation Stabilise, 1999 to 2000, which was the peace enforcement operation in East Timor, Interfet. And I can tell you that I wasn't minister, but that day in the cabinet when we made the decision to intervene in East Timor was one of the toughest days that we had, and we were lucky to have the force that we did that supported us in that difficult political decision. 2000 to 2001, Operation Tanager, which was as Tayet assumed control of Interfet, and then again in 2006, by which time I was already at the UN when violence flared again in East Timor. The Royal Australian Navy went there again. The next suite of operations related to the Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands, first Operation Plumbok in 2000, following the abduction of the then Prime Minister in the Solomons. 2000, Operation Dorsal in support of the peace negotiation process. And 2003 to 2004, Operation Anode in support of Ramsey. And Ramsey was a first for Australia. We'd never had a regional stabilisation mission of that type. And the important role of the Royal Australian Navy and the role of the Royal Australian Navy in giving us the confidence to be able to lead that mission first was very, very important to us. Then, of course, we had the operations in the Persian Gulf in support of the US-led international coalition against terrorism, Operation Slipper, started in 2001 to 2000, still continuing, as I understand it. In fact, I'm told that it is now in its 31st rotation. Nobody would have ever guessed. Then the operation to detect and deny access to unorthodox boat arrivals, the operations Relics 1 and Relics 2, was one of the most difficult experiences for the Royal Australian Navy off the north of Australia, and we all went through some very difficult times in relation to it, but those on the front line that had to make some very tough decisions did a wonderful job in those circumstances, and we were hugely appreciative. I'm starting to feel tired for the Navy, I have to say, and that's before we get to the operations in Iraq. 2003, Operation Bastille, support of the build-up. 2003, Operation Faulkner, the military operation. 2003 to 2009, Operation Catalyst in stabilisation and rehabilitation efforts. We had in 2004 to 5 Operations Sumatra to assist after the tsunami. Again, I can remember farewelling, I think it was Canimbla again out of Darwin, and thinking, thank goodness we had that capacity at that time. It was one of the, and I can remember being told on the wharves in Darwin that there was further equipment that they would have liked to take, but the ship wasn't big enough. And I thought, well, the next ships we get will be bigger. Even though some people don't argue for bigger ships, I think bigger ships give you more flexibility. Operation Quick State in Fiji in 2006. So a hugely busy period of time on a great range of different types of operations, and I can say that government was so appreciative of the professionalism and the judgment that Navy played in them all. I thought I'd just mention it before I sit down, just a few of the personal highlights. I've already mentioned the Southern Ocean and the fact that it really transformed the Southern Ocean in terms of the management of marine resources and conservation. One of my most meaningful experiences was on the Anzacs shortly after she had fired in anger in the Gulf. I've had the privilege at times to be at Gallipoli on Anzac Day and at Trabuc in Libya on Anzac Day, but to be on an operational Australian warship on Anzac Day was something that I'll never forget. Some interesting experiences in the Gulf also. As some of you will know, that the operational command of that force, the coalition force, rotated, and that Australians on occasions took command. And I was coincidentally on Australian warship when an incident occurred. The force was being commanded by an Australian officer on an American ship, and it was one of those small Iranian boats that got too close, and nobody was quite sure what the game was going to be, and it called for a response. And to hear over the radio the Australian officer calling in the American warship to intervene was something that I won't forget. I thought to myself, I wonder what they'd say about that in the US Congress, but nevertheless, I think it illustrates the confidence that existed within the alliance and within the forces that made up those coalitions. The experience of the tsunami reminds me to do up my tie in Aceh, was something I'll never forget, and one particular aspect. Immediately, of course, it was just after Christmas, and I remember Peter Cosgrove was Chief of the Defence Force, and we talked about the force, the capability we could send to help. We wanted to send air, materials by air, and the issue was where the aircraft could land, and the thought of Australian military aircraft landing in Aceh was a little beyond comprehension at the time. But I rang the Indonesian Defence Minister, and Cosgrove rang the Chief of the Indonesian Defence Force, and we both said the most useful place for us to land these resources would be in Aceh, and both without hesitation said go to it. And in some ways, Australia's relationship with Indonesia changed from that day. It's a little personal, I have to say, but I remember visiting Ramsey in the Solomon Islands, and I think it was one of our mine hunters we had there took me out to lay a wreath over the ship my father served on in the Second World War, the Canberra, that was sunk at that spot, and he survived. In fact, he was one of the few men that had boots on, and his task was to get his colleagues, as many as he could, off the ship. But it reminded me of the importance of Canberra in the history of the Royal Australian Navy, and I was, of course, present at the decommissioning of the FFG Canberra, which was a sad day, and I'm pleased that the first of our new large amphibious support ships is going to be called the Canberra, not that I had anything to do with choosing the name. I'll finish. I enjoyed going down in Rankin. Fortunately, Rankin also came up. Good experience for the Defence Minister to actually go down in a submarine. And the only time that I was pleased that something didn't work in the Navy, I was on a ship in the Gulf, and they decided this was a ship that was interdicting smuggling operations. And there was a large tanker that was to be boarded and inspected. And I could see it on the horizon, huge ship. And they said, "Minister, we're going to take you across to the ship and you can go on board and see what we do." And I said, "How am I going to get on board?" And they said, "They'll put down a rope ladder." Anyway, fortunately, the boarding vessel broke down, and the trip across to the tanker had to be missed. How pleased I was that the Navy on that occasion broke down. So thank you for the opportunity to complement what Kim said from Labor's period, to give you some of my experiences and reflections on the period of the Howard government.